Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keir Murray, and I'm joined by my dad, Dr. Richard Murray. It is a gorgeous spring day on this Monday, April 13th, 2020. Dad and I are convening in our homebound state, as we all are during this COVID crisis, to discuss how this relates to politics. By way of background, most of you, of course, know Richard Murray, who's a longtime political scientist at the University of Houston, well-known analyst of political matters in the state of Texas, around the country, in the Houston area more specifically. I'm a little bit on the different side of the equation. I'm a public affairs consultant based here in Houston. I've worked a lot of campaigns over the years, do some public relations type work as well. Again, we are not medical or public health experts. We're political people, and so we're not going to talk about the health aspects of this crisis. We're convening to focus on what it means for our politics in this country during these very eventful times. I have muted all participants other than Dad and myself just to keep things tidy in terms of the recording. I believe there's a messaging function where you can send me a question if you have one, and I'd urge you to do so. We'll try to get to at least a few of those over this half hour or so. So Dad, just to start out on this Monday, by last count, I think we had roughly 550,000 documented cases of COVID-19 in the United States of America. As of last night, about 22,000 fatalities, sadly. Those numbers are continuing to grow on a daily basis as more testing comes online and more Americans are hospitalized. Early projections suggested that as many as 100,000 or 200,000 Americans might die in this first wave of this health pandemic. I think thankfully some of those projections in recent days have been downgraded to more in the 50 to 60,000 range, which I think is welcome news for all of us. On a personal note, however, I would note that some of the dancing in the end zone I've seen among some that suggests that this means this crisis isn't a big deal, I think is badly off track in terms of understanding what's happening. This is a tragedy, no matter which way you slice it. And so I wanted to just kind of get your initial take on where we are now, a month after a national emergency was declared.
Well, it's clear from my perspective that the election season that's really going to get underway in earnest now that we've narrowed the field to Joe Biden and President Trump is just going to simply be dominated by this crisis. Even the most favorable outcomes on the healthcare front from reading the analysts there means that we're going to have serious repercussions for the health of Americans through the summer and into the fall. But even more so, there's no way the economic damage that's already been done and is intensifying is going to be anywhere near resolved before the presidential election on November 3rd.
Right. And, we've seen in the course of just 3 weeks, 17 million Americans file for unemployment benefits. That's 10% of the entire American workforce. Just a staggering number, given the reports we've heard that many are simply unable to get online to file those claims because the traffic is so high, suggests those numbers will continue to increase in the coming weeks. We could see unemployment north of 20% in this country. I think a figure not reached since the Great Depression, 90 or so years ago, 80, 90 years ago. What's your sense of how this is shaping up so far economically?
Well, after we had the Great Recession back in 2008 and 9, and a lot of the big financial institutions had to be bailed out, the government insisted on what we call a stress test. We're going through a massive stress test now in the United States, first of our healthcare system, which comes up pretty far short, but also in terms of what happens when you have a sudden economic collapse. And we're nowhere near ready to deal with that as well. We've got 50 different states with varying rules and situations and levels of support that are wholly inadequate. The federal government's already passed 3 pieces of legislation. More have to come. It's just such an enormous sudden economic contraction that may well prove fatal not just to industries like cruise ships, but to things like movie theaters that perhaps never come back as part of our meaningful economy. So we're looking at massive, massive restructuring of our economy, people that are going to be dislocated from the jobs they had planned on having for many years, with side effects particularly important for us here in Texas of the near collapse of the oil and gas business.
Right. And, we saw news stories over the weekend. Many saw video clips from San Antonio where we had more than 10,000 cars lined up at a food bank. I expect that situation is being replicated all across the state and country and is likely to become more acute in the coming weeks. One has to imagine there are a lot of Americans who are almost immediately financially devastated by this kind of an economic shock, but there are probably a whole lot of others who can manage for a little while, a month or two. But if this persists over time, it's going to create real long and difficult economic problems for just millions of American families.
Yeah, it's a rolling crisis. Maybe the healthcare front can be dealt with pretty effectively in the next 2 to 3 months, not the economy. This shock is so deep and profound. Back to energy, it looks like we've seen a contraction of about 35% in consumption of oil. Normally, the world consumes about 100 million barrels of oil a day. If it drops to 65 million, that's going to have huge impacts in many countries, including the United States, where this is one of our very biggest industries. People that work in an industry like this would find it difficult to relocate to other sectors of the economy that perhaps are healthier. So we've just got a whole bunch of associated problems that are going to get worse, not better, in coming weeks. And the lag indicators, as you've suggested, on unemployment, we probably are headed pretty much minimally to 20% unemployment. And the height of the Depression, we reached 25%, but that was after 3 years of contraction. We're talking about 3 or 4 weeks.
I wanted to turn a little bit into the context of where we are to the president. There were some stories that came out over the weekend. One lengthy piece in the New York Times talking about the timeline for when the president was made aware by members of his administration about the coming crisis and his response to it or lack thereof. Some pretty specific timelines that included some email documentation among members of the administration. President Trump, I saw on social media, has been vociferously denying that he knew what was going on. But what's your sense of how he has reacted to that and how it bodes for him politically?
Well, one thing we know about candidate Trump and President Trump for the last 5 years that he's been dominant is he doesn't change. And obviously that didn't finish him off as a candidate. He unexpectedly won an election in 2016. But I think that style has not served him well as president, particularly in a time of crisis where people look for certain leadership attributes, that they can believe in you, trust you, that your message is consistent, that you can rally the country behind you. And that's just not Mr. Trump's style. He's a puncher, a counterpuncher. He goes after his opponents, real and imagined, even when it doesn't make any sense for him to do so. So these further information that's coming out about he was told a lot of things and basically chose to ignore them or downplay them, that's going to stick with him through the rest of this year, through the election.
And he's, as we all know, is taken to these daily news conferences where some initial information is, distributed to the press corps and those watching on television about the crisis itself, and then typically morphs into just a banter session for him where he, as you said, airs grievances and talks about other issues. One of the other interesting stories in the last few days were press accounts that increasingly Republican members of Congress, consultants, and others who are, going to be involved in the election this fall, maybe at the presidential level, but also, for members of Congress and other races around the country, are becoming increasingly concerned that these long tirades with the press corps on a daily basis are neither helping the president himself nor down ballot Republicans who are going to be competing in a very difficult environment this fall. What do you make of that?
Well, Trump won election disregarding what most of us think of as conventional political wisdom about how you run campaigns. And again, he's not listening to anybody. He's still going with his gut. He loves the fact that he's on television in the afternoons now that he can't do the MAGA rallies anymore, which were, I think, a key narcotic for his system, and that he's missed dearly. But that's one of the casualties of this virus. But it's, I think, a very foolish way of squandering an opportunity. As a president in a crisis, you get an opportunity to rally the country. You typically get a significant rally around the flag effect. That didn't much happen this time. The little bump the president got quickly turned into a dead cat bounce, as they say on Wall Street. It's just a little bit up and then right back down. And you don't get a lot of bites at this apple in a crisis. People look to you, they pay attention. If they lose confidence in your ability, and now we've got the president yesterday musing to his friends and that maybe Dr. Fauci should go. The fact that I guess the New Yorker magazine is going to put the doctor on their cover, that puts you in danger with this president. He doesn't like anybody getting very positive press that's not sitting in the Oval Office.
Yeah, that's sort of were it to happen, would be a remarkable turn of events, given that, as you noted, the modest rally around the flag polling bounce that the president got a couple of weeks ago by a slate of new national polls that have come out in the last 4 or 5 days showed that that's dissipated, and he's back underwater in most cases against Joe Biden and in terms of his job approval rating. But the other thing those polls have consistently shown is that Anthony Fauci is the most trusted person in America around this COVID crisis. 70, 80% of Americans, regardless of party, trust his judgment and his experience. And were he to be kicked to the curb, I think, I mean, just again, as a political consultant, I'm trying to see how there's an upside to that if you're the president, other than just, on a personal level, getting someone he might view as a showboat out of the sphere of influence. But I'm having a hard time understanding how that would be helpful to the president were he to do it.
Well, normally the congressional Republicans, are pretty careful, and while many of them have major issues with the president, they keep it quiet. But I think they realize if you were to engage in a highly public firing or demoting of Dr. Fauci, it could have huge consequences for them. Running, 35 senators are up, 26, I think, of those are Republicans. More than half of their caucus, every House Republican, of course, about 195 are on the ballot. This is going to be a tough election for those folks. And now, very unlikely Republicans have much of a real shot at regaining the House of Representatives. And that means, Nancy Pelosi is going to remain a major power player. But also the Senate is coming into play much more than we thought 6 or 7 weeks ago.
Yeah. A long way to go, of course, but 6.5 months or so, but very interesting times in that regard. Let's turn a little bit to Joe Biden. I think a couple of interesting developments there. Just in the last hour or two, I believe, Bernie Sanders, his primary foe in the Democratic nomination contest, has officially endorsed Joe Biden. I think that's happened a lot sooner than that happened in 2016. What do you think about Bernie deciding early on to get behind Biden officially?
Well, it shows how there's a pretty big difference in this Democratic situation than was the case 4 years ago. There was a lot of bad feeling between Secretary Clinton and Senator Sanders in 2016. That's not the case between Joe Biden and Sanders. Personally, they respect each other. They obviously have very different policy positions. So I'm not surprised that Sanders made this early endorsement. He didn't endorse Clinton until July of 2016. So it's an important development. And I never had much doubt that Sanders personally would be strongly supportive. The bigger question remains, what about the people that were passionately backing the Vermont senator? Can they come on board? And that's still an open question.
How much do you think Sanders, if he's willing, can help that process of bringing his supporters along?
Well, I think he'd be quite helpful. According to the exit polls 4 years ago, about 8% of the Sanders people didn't just not vote for Hillary Clinton, they voted for Donald Trump. And that's probably a decisive factor in the 5 or 6 states that were really close. So if you can cut that down on the Democratic side from 8 to 2 or 3%, there are certainly, I think, some hardcore Sanders people, they're never going to come over to Joe Biden, and some of them will end up voting for Trump. But I don't think it's going to be 8%.
Yeah, and not to spend a lot of time on it, but let's tick back over to the vice presidential sweepstakes. That vetting process seems to be underway. There are 4 names that I've seen that continually rise to the top. 2 of his former competitors in the primary, Senators Kamala Harris of California and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan is another name that's come up a lot. And then Senator Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, also another very important state that the Democrats lost in 2016. Just quickly, where do you think we stand with the Veep stakes?
Well, if you look at this short list of 4, which I would agree is realistic, 3 of the 4 have Midwestern roots in this part of the country that pretty clearly, if it's a close election, are going to be decisive states again. Kamala Harris obviously is not from a competitive state, California, but she is a person of color, and minority voters saved Joe Biden, particularly Black voters, just a few weeks ago. So she's got something else on the table besides regional appeal. Personally, I think that it's more likely to be one of the presidential candidates, Klobuchar or Harris. They were thoroughly vetted as candidates for president. But now the new entrant of the governor of Michigan, who's become well known nationally in the last 3 or 4 weeks, I think she's got a serious shot at being on the ticket. And because she is a governor of a state that's been severely impacted, she's going to be in the news. Whereas the senators, they vote, but they're not running anything. And Governor Whitmer is, and she can advance her cause by how she handles this crisis in Michigan, a state that has 16 electoral votes and figures to be really, really close again.
And she's, of course, as we know, gotten on the radar screen of the president, who's attacked her on social media as he frequently does with perceived and real enemies. So maybe that helps her standing in terms of potentially becoming the number 2 pick.
Being labeled a half-wit by the president probably doesn't hurt you on the Democratic side.
Before we leave Bernie Sanders entirely, I'm curious, how do you think Sanders would have fared if this crisis had erupted a month earlier in the presidential race?
Or even 2 weeks earlier? The decisive dates in terms of influencing our own politics were at the very end of February and the first couple of weeks of March, so that we reached the point, so by the 17th, that we had to shut down our elections. If this thing had broken not late February, but February 10 or 12, then I think you would have had, Sanders doing well in Iowa, winning in New Hampshire, winning big time in Nevada, just as this crisis they were developing, and then it plays to 2 of his biggest cards. There's something badly wrong with our healthcare system. Every speech Sanders has given, virtually all of his life in politics, was talking about our healthcare system is we're the only wealthy country in the world that doesn't have universal health care. Well, if you have a healthcare crisis and millions of people are being harmed, that plays into Sanders' wheelhouse. But also, of course, he's saying, and our economic system is broken. And now we find millions of people are losing their job and their health insurance. I think if this crisis had been 2 weeks earlier, that we would have had a very different result on Super Tuesday, that Sanders, I think, would have very likely have been unstoppable. And then we would shut down the process. And with instead of Biden being pretty much locked in, Sanders with no way of catching him. So timing is so critical in life and in politics. And Bernie just had really, really bad luck. If this thing were coming, it would have been far better for his candidacy if it had come 2 weeks earlier.
Yeah, his sort of bread and butter policy prescriptions about universal health care and about, uh, you know, taxing the rich to take care of ordinary Americans, policies that I think a lot of folks have considered outside the mainstream in this economic context, in this healthcare context, start sounding a lot more reasonable to a lot more people than would have thought those fantasy a few weeks earlier.
Yeah, Bernie's policies always polled pretty well, but what was really holding him back was the sense that we got to beat Trump, and Bernie's not the guy to do it. But with this explosion of the healthcare system and the economy, all of a sudden Bernie looks like he can win in November, and that would have removed the single biggest block to his securing the nomination. That I think people would say, hey, not only was this guy maybe right about some of these big issues, but he can win in November.
Right. As you said, timing's everything. Before we leave Joe Biden as a subject, one other set of stories that came out in some publications over the weekend were these allegations from 25 years ago or so of sexual misconduct with a former staffer in his Capitol office. So what do you make of that situation?
Well, I think certainly in this day and age, if such allegations are made, they have to be taken very seriously. In terms of the political impact, though, it's very, very different if you're in a competitive primary among other Democrats and this kind of allegation is made. I think it can be far more damaging than in a general election where your opponent, this is not his strong suit, let us put it charitably. And so it's fortunate for Biden, again, that he's basically locked up the nomination. It's also fortunate so far that the story's been revealed that there's not any supportive evidence that this is part of a pattern of behavior by this 77-year-old man. And news organizations have taken these charges very seriously. Both the Washington Post and New York Times have interviewed the individual lady who was, I think, about 25 years old at the time of the allegations. And they can't find much supportive evidence from other parties other than some people say, yes, she told us about this, but many other women that have worked in or around Senator Biden, Vice President Biden, say it's not in character. He had this was not his reputation, and as one put it, we know who the good guys and the bad guys are on Capitol Hill, and Biden was considered one of the good guys. And so I don't think this is going to be a game changer. Now, if this allegation had been made in October, November, December, where the whole Democratic field is out there running, including a half dozen women candidates, this could have been a big, big story.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I think we have seen reports on Biden from the past about, just not respecting personal space with women, touching their shoulders, their hair, that kind of thing, not appropriate conduct. But this allegation, I think, was at a different level than that. And if there's not a pattern, or if it can't be fully corroborated, which the story I read suggested it couldn't be, at least now at this juncture, then I agree with you. I'm not sure it'll have the impact that it might have at a different time or if in a different context. I want to move on to this issue of when we reopen the economy. This is, I think, a question that's very much on the mind of almost all Americans. So, with the economic pain that so many are feeling, people want to get back to being productive. Nobody wants to see food lines and people unemployed. And the question is, of course, how to responsibly do that. We saw Italy extend its nationwide shutdown basically until the 1st of May. They're several weeks ahead of us in terms of the trajectory of this health crisis. So that's one, bit of information to take. I noticed this afternoon that the president has come up with a council on reopening the economy that includes his daughter, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who I guess has moved on from solving Middle Eastern peace and solving the coronavirus crisis itself to now reopening the economy. Steve Mnuchin, Larry Kudlow, Mark Meadows, his new chief of staff, sort of an insider crew. I don't see a lot of outside economic and business experts on this council. Trump has also, of course, been bickering with governors around the country, saying that he alone has the absolute authority to open the U.S. economy whenever he wants. Meanwhile, governors are convening with their counterparts in other states and talking about when they might, on an individual basis, decide to reopen things depending on how the health crisis is going in their particular state. As you know, of course, we have a federal system where states have a lot of leeway to act independently in this regard. Can Trump just reopen the economy whenever he wants? And is this the council of friends and family that's going to show the way to get it done?
Well, on the council, it's sort of like the old Claude Rains line in the 1942 movie Casablanca: round up the usual suspects. Trump goes back to this same handful of people he's related to or that he trusts. It's a small group. It's very insular, and they're doing another job here. Really, the federal government has a lot of power. The president is the commander in chief. He can, get the captain of a aircraft carrier fired instantly, just by signaling, perhaps, to some who want to follow his will. But in terms of running our schools, police powers, those are largely at the state level. And the governors have much more control. But I would caution very much, this very correctly, it's often pointed out, the economy is not a light switch. You just can't turn it on and off. Among other things, even if all the officials, business leaders agree on plan A, they can't tell consumers what to do. 70% of our economy is consumer driven. If consumers decide to stay home, not to fly on planes, not to eat in restaurants, no public official can change that behavior. You can open up, an airline up, but if nobody flies, the plane's still empty. You can resume a lot of businesses, but if people don't feel comfortable about going out in crowds or engaging in normal economic activity, those businesses are still going to suffer. They may be open, but not functional. So this is going to be messy. It's going to be bumpy because we're a federal system and the 50 different states went into this crisis at different times, and therefore we're going to come out of it at different times. I think the rational thing is to see what happens in other countries like South Korea that did a better job on the healthcare front. Watch countries like Italy that were, like we are, devastated by the crisis. But you've got to be flexible once you start reopening. We may find out, it was too soon. And you have to be prepared to adjust course going forward. If we get a significant resurgence, you've got to go to plan B.
Yeah, and along the lines of the consumer economy, I mean, it's not just that people will feel skittish, I think, about going out into public and mingling with others. It's that with the job loss that people have suffered, there's a lot less disposable income floating around than there had been previously, which again, I think is going to temper demand on retail, on restaurants, on hospitality and vacation travel and those kinds of, and even, buy things like buying a new car. Well, maybe you'll put it off a year or two and just drive the old one. And if you're not feeling good about your personal financial situation. So I think it has all kinds of potential ripple effects in that regard.
One of the, we only had in the last century the experience of the Great Depression that would be comparable to an economic shock. One of the reasons that the country was so slow to recover, and we changed the political leadership. We got a new president who was popular and aggressive action by Congress in 1933, but we stayed in the Depression. What was killing us in the 1930s was people weren't spending. Even when they started getting some money back, they saved. Well, your savings cuts into my income because when you buy, it helps the person on the other side of the table. Saving makes a lot of sense for individuals and families, but if you get too much saving, it's devastating to economic recovery. And the only way we got out of that in the 1930s was the rise of Hitler, the rearming, and then the World War II, which solved the problem.
Right. And we talked about sort of the president versus governors in the context of who has the authority to do what. On a smaller level in Texas, we've sort of seen this play out where the governor, Greg Abbott, has been pretty hands-off in terms of, issuing decrees about what can and cannot be done in the state. And so you've had various local municipalities, counties, other entities who've been acting in different regards depending on who's in charge. How do you see that dynamic in the state of Texas between Greg Abbott and, Clay Jenkins, the county judge in Dallas, and Lena Hidalgo, the county judge here, and Sylvester Turner, the mayor of Houston, various other parts of this municipalities and counties around the state?
Well, Greg Abbott has risen in politics by making sure he doesn't get crossways with the very conservative Republican base that votes in primaries and keeping his head down in most other regards. Now he's got a crisis that is forcing him to be more public. He's, being pressed on the one hand by the sizable business communities in the state that are mostly aligned with the Republican Party, saying we got to get going again. We're all going broke. But on the other hand, the public health folks are cautioning we don't want to move too quickly. And if you are seen as coming too quickly out of these, particularly maintaining social distance, which is devastating to a lot of business enterprises, but it's probably the single most effective thing we can do in this what figures to be a long period where the virus is still out there. We don't have a vaccine, but if you maintain social distance, it's going to hugely hobble your economic recovery. So that's basically what you have to choose. If you let lots of businesses reopen and you dispense with the social distance measure, you're risking a resurgence of the virus, and we don't have a vaccine in sight.
And I think, I'm curious too, around with regard to Texas, we have about $10 billion in the state's rainy day fund, I believe, give or take. A lot of that, of course, is generated by oil and gas severance tax. As you pointed out, that industry is in free fall for reasons both related and unrelated to the COVID crisis. Do you foresee the governor needing to call a special session sometime this year to figure out how the state taps some of that pool of money to help folks economically in the state? And if he were to do that, is there any chance that the voting mechanisms, voting by mail, any of that might be on the call for a special session, or is he going to avoid that for as long as he possibly can?
Well, Abbott's track record with the rainy day fund was it's not raining in Harvey, so I'm not going to call back the legislature or dispense a lot of money out of that. So in the one previous big crisis we've had on his tenure, he did not respond. But this is bigger. It affects the entire economy of the state. But calling a session back in puts state government front and center just weeks before the critical November election. Abbott's not on the ballot, but the senior senator is. All the House members are on the ballot in what figures to be our most competitive legislative election of the 21st century, where Republicans are at real risk of losing their majority. And if you call people back in the session and they have to cast tough votes, that's not helpful to the 84 Republicans, I guess, that are in the state House, that are all of whom are up for election. So I think that one hand, a lot of resistance to bring the legislature back into session. You're going to have to cast some tough votes, and those can hurt you in an election just a few weeks away. Yeah. Then you'll have this issue of, overwhelmingly people like voting by mail option. Not that they necessarily are going to do it, but they like to have the option of that, particularly if they're concerned about their health. So if you bring the ledge back into session, you don't vote by mail, that may hurt you in the election as well. So I think the inclination of the governor would be to try to lay low, not to call a special session, to tough it out, not to tap in, at least through legislative action, to the rainy day fund, which is going to be wholly inadequate next year when the regular legislative session comes back together, and you're going to need every dollar you can scrounge up from every source, particularly from Washington, D.C.
Yeah. And just for those who don't know, in Texas, unless you are disabled or residing outside of the state for work or educational purposes, you have to be 65 or older to vote by mail in the state. And other states, of course, have more universal, anybody can request a mail ballot. And I'm skeptical that we'll see that in Texas anytime soon, but people are already calling for it. Well, we've reached the half-hour mark, so I don't want to drone on too much longer. Is there anything you'd like to sort of say to wrap up in closing?
Well, this is a fascinating, terrible story that we're living through. We're still 6.5 months away from our election, assuming we carry it off. And I think one way or the other, we have to. If we had an election again in the middle of the Civil War, we should have an election in the middle of this health crisis and economic freefall. But exactly how that's going to work, we're going to, see that a lot of that fought out in state capitals. Some will have their legislature back into session. More of them will, I think, ease up on vote by mail. In Texas, it looks like there may be some wiggle room for local officials, particularly in the populous urban counties where voting lines are probably going to be a problem, to perhaps ease some of the restrictions, open many more polling places, maybe extend, and this may require legislative action, the early vote period, so that, because that's when most Texans are now voting. They're voting in person early. 70% of our vote comes that way. But, last time around, there were long lines. So that doesn't solve your election day problem if you're concerned about being close to people where it's hard to maintain a 6-foot separation.
Yeah, and not to mention in Texas, where this will be the first general election in decades where we've not had straight ticket voting, which, especially in our big urban counties with a lot of races on the ballot for judge and other things, lengthens the time each voter needs in the polling place to cast his or her ballot, instead of just picking Democratic Party or Republican Party or Libertarian, I guess. You got to go, if you're going to vote all the way, you got to go through every race. And, Harris County, where we're based, I think often has one of the longest ballots in the country. We've got dozens of judges and things. And that's to say it's going to slow the process down for people voting in person. And so I think that's another consideration that has to be addressed.
One of the interesting things about this whole vote by mail is that the president has sort of become fixated that this is some kind of scheme that the Democrats are pushing because he thinks it will greatly benefit the other party. But vote by mail has historically been strongly supported by Republicans. So a lot of local and state Republicans say, whoa, particularly in a state like Florida, where 20% of the population are over 65 years of age, we want to vote by mail. Don't mess with this. So it's one of the areas where there's a gap between many Republican office holders who say, hey, this system works pretty well for us, and the president, who is pretty clear to him. Once the president fixes on something, he doesn't get off of it.
Yeah. And in all the polling that I've seen recently, voting by mail is popular with all Americans, regardless of party. Yeah. They pretty much think everybody should have the option to do it, but not our decision to make. Okay, Dad. Well, thanks again for joining today, and we'll try to keep doing these once a week. We are going to post them on YouTube for people to view. I think if you search Murray Men on Politics, you should be able to find these podcasts. And thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.